Imagine you are standing in the middle of something that feels, for all the world, like permanence. The servers are humming, the traffic numbers are climbing. The year is 2008, and MySpace is not merely a website, it is a cultural fact, as inevitable as television, as embedded as the telephone. 55 million unique visitors arrive each month. Music artists build careers on its pages. Entire generations form their first digital identities here. News Corp paid $580 million for this company in 2005, and the consensus in every boardroom, every industry publication, and every casual conversation about the internet is the same. This is what winning looks like. Then the silence. By 2011, the silence is total. The same offices that once required security checkpoints to enter now have surplus furniture in the hallways. The executive team has turned over twice. The user base has not merely shrunk, it has evaporated with the particular thoroughness of something that people not only left, but stopped mentioning. A company that was once a symbol of the internet's limitless possibility has become, in the span of less than a decade, a byword for getting it catastrophically wrong. This is not a story about bad luck. It is a story about the subtle mechanics of institutional self-deception, how organizations at their most powerful are often, at the same time, most vulnerable to the forces they cannot bring themselves to see clearly. The company that became MySpace was born in 2003 in a modest office space in Santa Monica, California, founded by Tom Anderson and Chris DeWolf, along with a small team at the internet marketing firm eUniverse. It was not, in its origins, a revolutionary act of vision. It was a practical response to what was already working. Friendster, an early social networking site, had demonstrated an obvious appetite among internet users for something more personal than email, more social than a homepage, a space that was yours, that was findable, that connected you to other people in the way a hallway or a party might. When Friendster struggled under its own traffic and imposed restrictions that users found suffocating, Anderson and DeWolf moved quickly to fill the gap. What MySpace offered in those early years was something genuinely distinctive: latitude. Users could customize their profile pages with a freedom that felt, at the time, almost reckless. HTML and CSS, if you knew how to use them, could transform a profile into something personal, even artistic. Musicians could upload their own tracks. Independent filmmakers could embed their work. The platform was loud, cluttered, expressive, and that was precisely the point. It reflected the sensibility of its users back at them, which is the oldest trick in the history of successful products. The music community, in particular, found in MySpace something that had not existed before: direct access to an audience at scale without a label intermediary. Artists who would never have seen the inside of a major label conference room were building fan bases in the hundreds of thousands. The platform was not just a social network. It was an industry disruptor, and the music industry's relationship with it was that peculiar mixture of dependence and resentment that tends to precede something permanent. By 2005, when Rupert Murdoch's News Corp completed its acquisition for $580 million, MySpace was the most visited website in the United States. The acquisition was celebrated, dissected, and widely interpreted as confirmation that old media had finally understood new media. The price seemed, to many observers at the time, either bold or excessive, but not, by the standards of internet valuations, obviously wrong. The assets were real. The audience was enormous. The growth curve was steep and showed no obvious signs of flattening. The people inside the building had every reason to believe they had already won. What happened next did not announce itself as catastrophe. It rarely does. The meeting that mattered was not a single meeting, and the decision that mattered was not a single decision. But there was a logic that emerged inside MySpace after the acquisition, a logic that was internally coherent, financially rational, and ultimately fatal. News Corp had paid a very large sum of money for MySpace, and it expected a return. The most obvious path to that return was advertising revenue. MySpace had an audience of tens of millions, and that audience was young, engaged, and demonstrably willing to spend time on the platform. Advertisers wanted access to that audience. The platform that connected advertisers to users most efficiently would generate the most revenue. This is not a complicated chain of reasoning, and it would have sounded, in any conference room in 2005 or 2006, entirely sensible. What it quietly displaced was a different set of priorities, the ones that had made the audience want to be there in the first place. The engineers and product managers who raised concerns about the advertising strategy were not, by most accounts, ignored because their concerns were unheard. They were overruled because the counter-arguments were genuinely persuasive. The revenue projections were real. The advertiser relationships were real. The competitive threat from Facebook, which was still a network largely confined to college campuses, did not yet register as existential. When your platform has 55 million users and your competitor has 15 million, it is not irrational to assume that your advantages are durable. But the assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong was a quieter one, buried beneath the financial logic. The assumption that user experience was a secondary variable, that what brought people to a social network and what kept them there was fundamentally different from what brought people to a broadcast network or a newspaper. That the transaction was not between a publisher and an audience, but between a community and itself, and that once you degraded the community's experience in service of your revenue model, you were not merely irritating users, but severing the relationship that made the platform valuable in the first place. MySpace's pages became, over the following years, progressively more difficult to use. Load times lengthened. Intrusive advertising interrupted interactions that had previously felt organic. The HTML customization that had been one of the platform's defining features became a vector for spam and malware, and attempts to address it made the platform feel simultaneously more restrictive and less secure. The company was caught in a contradiction it could not resolve. The features that defined its identity were also the features that made it hardest to monetize cleanly and maintain safely. Meanwhile, in a parallel universe that was slowly becoming the same universe, Facebook was building something architecturally different. Mark Zuckerberg's platform was not trying to be a creative canvas. It was trying to be a social graph, a clean, fast, reliable map of who you knew and what they were doing. The design was deliberately simple. The advertising, when it came, was relatively contained. The experience of using Facebook felt, by comparison to MySpace, like moving from a crowded bazaar into a well-organized shop. The defections began slowly enough to be explained away. Early adopters, the argument went, always chased novelty. College students would return once Facebook's campus exclusivity ended and the platform lost its social cachet. The core user base, the music fans, the older demographics, the communities that had built genuine lives on MySpace would stay. Some of them did, for a while. But the mathematics of network effects work in both directions. When a social network gains users, it becomes more valuable to the users already there, which attracts more users, which makes it more valuable still. When it loses users, the same mechanism reverses. The people you join MySpace to stay connected to are logging in less frequently, so you log in less frequently, so they have less reason to stay. The spiral is self-reinforcing, and once it achieves a certain velocity, it is very difficult to reverse. By 2007, Facebook had surpassed MySpace in international traffic. By 2008, it had surpassed it in US traffic as well. These were not incremental declines, they were indicators of a structural shift in where the cultural center of gravity had moved. MySpace's response to this shift was, in retrospect, a series of initiatives that each made sense in isolation and collectively made nothing better. The platform redesigned its interface multiple times in rapid succession, each redesign alienating users who had grown accustomed to the previous version without clearly winning new ones. It expanded into areas, music streaming, games, video, that were adjacent to its strengths, but spread resources across a wider surface than the organization could effectively manage. Leadership changes came frequently enough that the strategic continuity required for any of these efforts to compound was perpetually disrupted. Between 2008 and 2010, News Corp wrote down the value of MySpace by hundreds of millions of dollars. By the middle of 2010, the platform had shed more than half of its peak workforce through a series of layoffs that were announced with language about restructuring and refocusing that everyone inside understood to mean something more final. Engineers left for competitors. Product managers took their institutional knowledge to startups. The people who had built the thing were no longer there to defend or extend it. The advertising revenue that had been the cornerstone of the strategy declined in proportion to the audience, and then faster than the audience, as advertisers followed users to platforms where engagement remained higher and measurement was cleaner. The core business model was unwinding, and the platform it was built on was unwinding simultaneously. In June 2011, News Corp sold MySpace to Specific Media Group and the singer Justin Timberlake for $35 million. Against a purchase price of $580 million, the arithmetic is stark. The company did not file for bankruptcy, and it was not shuttered, but $35 million, in the context of what had been paid and what had been projected, was an acknowledgement of something close to total failure. The employees who remained learned about the sale from press reports, in many cases, before they heard from management. The equity that had once represented a meaningful piece of a major internet property was, for most of them, worth nothing they could spend. The engineers who had maintained the platform through its decline dispersed into the industry, carrying expertise in distributed systems and social product design that other companies would benefit from. The offices in Beverly Hills were eventually vacated and reassigned. The music artists who had built audiences on MySpace found those audiences suddenly inaccessible or unreachable, not gone, exactly, but fragmented, migrated, no longer organized around a platform that anyone reliably visited. Some of them rebuilt elsewhere. Others simply lost what they had built. The conventional reading of MySpace's failure is that it was out-innovated, that Facebook simply built a better product and the market rewarded the better product. This reading is not wrong, but it misses something structurally important. MySpace did not fail because it stopped innovating. It failed because its ownership structure created an incentive to extract value from its user base faster than the user base could sustain. The platform's users were not customers in any transactional sense. They never paid for the service, and their relationship to the company was entirely mediated by the experience the platform provided. When that experience was systematically degraded in service of short-term revenue targets, users did not complain through a feedback mechanism that leadership could measure and respond to. They simply drifted away, in ones and tens, and eventually millions, to somewhere that felt better. The trap is not unique to MySpace. It is the trap that any organization falls into when it begins treating its audience as a resource to be harvested rather than a relationship to be maintained. The warning signs are rarely visible from inside the organization because the people making the decisions are not experiencing the product the way users experience it. They are experiencing a revenue dashboard. The dashboard looks fine until suddenly and irreversibly it doesn't. What makes MySpace's particular version of this trap instructive is the speed of the reversal. In industries where customer relationships are contractual or habitual, banking, telecommunications, utilities, the gap between strategic error and visible consequence can be measured in years. In social networking, where the relationship between user and platform is entirely voluntary and switching costs are close to zero, that gap is measured in months. The discipline required to build and sustain that kind of relationship is different in kind from the discipline required to manage a traditional media asset. News Corp, which was a traditional media company, may have understood the difference intellectually without ever quite building it into the operating model. MySpace still exists in a technical sense. The brand name was retained through subsequent ownership changes, and for a period, the platform attempted to reposition itself as a destination for music discovery and artist promotion, a narrower version of what it had once been. Whether anything meaningful remains of that effort depends on how you define meaningful. What does not exist is the community that once organized itself there. The 55 million people who built profiles, discovered music, argued in comment sections, and formed something that felt, briefly, like a shared space. That community migrated, dispersed, and reconstituted itself elsewhere in smaller pieces across platforms that most of them use today without thinking about where they came from. The real legacy of MySpace may be this. It demonstrated, earlier and more completely than almost any other case, that in networked markets, the relationship between a platform and its users is not a contract but a compact, and that when a company inherits that compact without fully understanding what created it, what it requires, and what it cannot survive, the result is not decline. It is departure. And in networked markets, departure is permanent. The users do not come back. They were never really yours to begin with.